نحن الآن في صرح أحد أشهر جامعات أمريكا، معهد ماساتشوستس للتقنية MIT في بوسطن. سبب الزيارة إجراء حوار خاص مع البروفيسور نعوم تشومسكي، أبرز وأهم منظر سياسي وناشط أمريكي وأستاذ اللسانيات والفلسفة في جامعة MIT، وفي أول لقاء له مع الميادين. Professor Chomsky, welcome to Al Mayadeen. This is your first time on Al Mayadeen. It's an honor for us, and we're looking for a very good exchange of views with you.
Glad to be with you.
Thank you. Professor, in your opinion, how you characterize today's world? Non-polar, multipolar, or what? The world system.
Yeah. Well, I think it's helpful just to say a few words of background. In 1945, it was pretty straightforward to describe the world system. The United States emerged from the war with a position of overwhelming power. It had 50% of the world's wealth, controlled the hemisphere, both oceans, the opposite sides of both oceans, and it still didn't. There was still a separate power, the Soviet system, but much smaller and confined basically to Eastern Europe. The planners understood that and planned and had ideas about how to create a world system, which they proceeded to implement. In the world system that they had in mind and sought to implement, which was commensurate with U.S. power, the U.S. would control the Western Hemisphere as a matter of course, would essentially displace Britain and slowly take over the former British Empire, including crucial energy resources of the Middle East. It would take over Asia and the heartland of Eurasia, the commercial industrial centers of Europe, Western Europe, and the rest would be for discussion.
But the current situation...
Coming to the present, if you get to about 1970, the U.S. share of world wealth had declined to about 25%, still enormous, but not 50%. By that time, it was recognized that the world was economically becoming tripolar. North America, based in the United States, Europe, based in Germany primarily, and East Asia, based at that time primarily in Japan, now China and other industrial countries on the periphery, Japan's former colonies. It was tripolar economically, but not militarily or in terms of influence and domination. It was still pretty much a U.S.-controlled world. In the last 10 years, roughly, something quite significant has happened. The Western Hemisphere has broken free of U.S. control. You can see it very clearly in the last hemispheric conference about a year ago in Colombia. The United States and Canada were completely isolated on every significant issue raised. The rest of the hemisphere sharply disagreed. The concern about the so-called Arab Spring, the MENA countries, Middle East, North Africa, there was a lot of concern in the West because it was feared they might go in the same direction. They might go towards independence, some form of democracy, and so on. And of course, the West, U.S. and its allies, are very frightened of democracy in the region for obvious reasons. It will reflect public opinion instead of the opinion of dictators and tiny elites linked to the West. They talk about democracy, but of course can't tolerate it. And I won't go through the record so far, but it's a kind of a standoff. The oil dictatorships, the countries that really matter to the West, because that's where the energy is, they're stable, everything's under control, and the U.S. has backed harshly repressive measures in eastern Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, elsewhere. Egypt and Tunisia, it's in flux. There's a lot of complications. But so far, they haven't lost the Mainite countries so far. When you get to the structure of the world system today, it's, I wouldn't say it's multipolar. The United States is still overwhelmingly dominant in most dimensions, but power has become diversified, undoubtedly.
If we take, for example, the Syrian crisis and how United States and Russia and China, we have the veto many times from both of them, China and Russia. It was by many accounts that this is probably one significant signal about how the world system is being shaped by, for the first time, Russia and China together. They're standing up to the United States.
I'm not at all convinced of that. I suspect that the United States rather welcomed the veto because that gave a pretext for doing what they want to do anyway, namely not intervening. If the U.S., Britain, France had wanted to intervene, they wouldn't care one way or another about a Security Council veto. They'd do what they want. They'd set up a coalition of the willing and, you know, go ahead.
So this is a sign of the decline and not being able to do anything. So it was a cover, almost.
I think they have not decided what they do want to do. Who do they want to support? After all, Assad was a pretty decent ally for the United States. He cooperated with the U.S. intelligence. He cooperated with the so-called war on terror, you know, kept the border quiet. Of course, very brutal within, but that's never been a primary consideration. And I think Washington is concerned about whether some alternative to Assad might be less congenial as an ally. So they're standing off. In fact, one rather striking fact about the Syrian conflict, which is a horror story, I don't have to go into that. The country is kind of on its road to suicide unless something happens. But there would be one very simple way for the United States and Israel to support the rebels without sending a single pistol. It would be enough for Israel to mobilize forces on the Golan Heights, which it's done in the past when it wanted to. And that would necessarily draw Syrian military forces to the south. It would relieve the pressure on the north. Simple method of supporting the rebels, but there's no hint of it, not even a word of discussion, which is one of many reasons for suspecting, I think, that the U.S. doesn't much want to get involved. France is a little more open about supporting the rebels, but Britain a little, but not much. So
but do you think the U.S. position is not to call for regime change in Syria? Because they have been calling
waiting to
step down, you know,
I think
about a year and a half for the Assad.
They basically have no policy except just letting the Syrians kill each other, which is probably a satisfactory policy for the U.S. Kind of like the Iraq-Iran war. The United States and its allies were willing to support both sides. So Israel, U.S. client, was arming Iran. The United States and its allies were supporting Iraq. And as long as they were just killing each other, that's fine. Actually, it's kind of reminiscent of a remark by Harry Truman when he was a senator during the Second World War. He commented that as long as the Germans and the Russians are slaughtering each other, that's fine. We should just let them do it. We'll move in later and pick up the pieces. It's not an unnatural view. Britain, France, other imperial powers have had the same conception. And I suspect that's what's happening in Syria. It's no harm to U.S. global interests if Syrians slaughter each other and destroy the country. You know, who cares? But the last comment about, but global order is more diverse, like the BRICS countries.
So who's shaping this world order? Because I want to ask you in particular about not only the major countries, Western and others, like we're talking about China, Russia, India rising. But we're talking about regional power in the Middle East in particular. We have Turkey, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Egypt, we have Israel. And we see that sometimes there is enough room for those regional power to play around. Like for instance, in the Syrian crisis, we see that the margin of freedom of those regional power is kind of extended a little bit.
A little, but not very much. I mean, they're not doing anything much that conflicts with the goals of the major powers. Primarily the United States still remains dominant in the region. They do have some initiative, but you're right that the smaller powers are beginning to play a role. The major case of that, China is one case, but though I think its power is exaggerated. And the BRICS countries are another, you know. They're now significant actors. They can't impose their policies. So for example, when the three traditional imperial powers, France, Britain, the United States, joined the rebels in Libya as their air force, actually in violation of the Security Council orders. The BRICS countries strongly opposed it. They called for negotiations, as did the African Union and even the International Crisis Group, most others, but it was disregarded. They're not significant enough yet to interfere with imperial policies. China, of course, opposed it too, but didn't matter. But they're not. They can't be disregarded. For example, we've just passed the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which practically brought about a probably terminal nuclear war. Came very close. One thing that's ignored. Several things are ignored. One is that it's sort of known that the United States, of course, had missiles surrounding Russia, missiles in Turkey, elsewhere, and that's normal. We of course, can threaten others. But what's a little discussed is that the Kennedy administration had just placed long-range missiles with nuclear warheads in Okinawa, aimed at China at a period of considerable regional tension there, and that's just normal. We don't talk about that. But it's less possible now, but still things like that are happening. U.S. is, along with South Korea, building a big naval base on Jeju Island aimed at China and so on.
So the question would be for United States as a declining power, although Obama in his first speech to the Arab world in Cairo, if you remember, he denied that the United States is an empire, not to mention the empire in decline. What do you think, with the economic crisis, with the financial crisis, with the kind of stagnation of political system in the United States between the two parties, what kind of role you envision for the United States in the future, in this world system? What kind of role they're still able to play, in your opinion?
Well, you make a very important point. Part of the American decline, which is nowhere near as much as claimed, but is real, part of it is self-inflicted. It's not just today, but for the last roughly 30 years, the neoliberal period. During that, practically everywhere where neoliberal policies have been implemented, it's been pretty harmful to the societies. It benefited wealthy elites, concentrated wealth, and so on. But for most people, it was ranged between harmful and disastrous. And much of the uprisings today are opposition to the neoliberal rules. In fact, in Latin America, that was a core part. And also in the MENA countries, an effort to oppose the effect of the neoliberal regime, and the United States and France and Tunisia are trying to reimpose it. It's part of the struggle that's going on. Take a look at the United States right now. There are two political parties, not very different in fact, both sort of the business party. They reflect the interests and concerns of the more wealthy sectors. That's been shown overwhelmingly by mainstream political science research. the lower portion on the income scale, maybe 70%, are essentially disenfranchised. Their opinions have no influence on policy.